now.
Okay, well, thank you. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here, and in a session with such people of huge stature. I'm really happy to be here. So, translating neuroscience into clinical practice in low and mid-resource settings. My disclosure is a research grant from Chiesi until 2017. So in the next 25 minutes or so, I want to cover 4 main areas, touch on therapeutic hypothermia, and the need, why we need neuroprotective therapies as adjuncts, to then focus on what actually do we need in low and mid-resource settings, and think about the simple practical therapies which might be applicable. Touch on inflammation sensitization, and finish with sex dimorphism. And actually I start with sex dimorphism. This is the incidence of neonatal encephalopathy cases by region and gender in 2010. And you can see in the high income settings the incidence is around 1 to 2.5 per 1,000 births. But if you go to sub-Saharan Africa, we're up to 10 to 25 per 1,000 births. And you can see across all settings, and we saw this in the just recent poster session, we have more pathology and it's more common in boys in every setting. So, therapeutic hypothermia is the result of 20 years program of research, and is probably one of the most significant advances in the care of the newborn. And since 2010, we have NICE guidance in the UK. This is a baby in the UK at UCH with SARNAT stage 2, undergoing 72 hours of therapeutic hypothermia with a server-controlled device. We're all very aware of this setup, and we have the luxury of huge intensive care support around this baby. This baby is ventilated, sedated, and has continuous video EEG running. We know that cooling provides multiple pathways for protection. We know it reduces seizures, reduces free radicals, allows time for endogenous repair, reduces your metabolic rate, reduces cell death and inflammation. We also know from previous studies run by Sita Shankaran looking at whether longer and deeper cooling might be better. We know that the cooling protocol that was first devised of 72 hours at 33.5 degrees is the most optimal at the moment. And we saw this in the preclinical model when we looked at different brain temperatures and cooled by 3.5 degrees or 5 degrees. And we saw similar protection if you cool that amount. But if you overdo it and you cool by 8.5 degrees, you end up having damage. And it's shown quite clearly here, looking at the tunnel counts on the piglet brain. And to get your iron, you've got normothermia in the red, you've got 35 degrees in yellow, 33.5 degrees in green, and cooling to 30 degrees in blue. So you can see here this U-shaped curve of damage that if you go below a threshold of, we think, around 33.5 degrees, you will have no protection. Now, the reason I tell you this at this point is that I then want to show you by contrast. This is a baby in Ghana, in one of the university hospitals in Ghana, where Catherine Martinello and myself with Christabel have been doing some work in babies with neonatal encephalopathy. And there is no cooling machines. In fact, there are no blankets. And this is a baby who was undergoing facilitated passive cooling, comprising infants being allowed to passively lower their body temperature in the days after birth, which appears to be an emerging pragmatic practice in some West African neonatal units. So this is a very similar baby to the one I showed you in the first picture from UCH, stage 2 SARNAT. This, however, baby is undergoing facilitated passive cooling. The ward had run out of cot sheets. The baby had persistent seizures that required all medicines available to the team. The baby has nasal cannula oxygen and is on a midazolam infusion. and the tape in the left axillary area is holding the probe for the monitoring of the surface temperature. So there are stark differences, and we need to understand this if we are going to be applying the most appropriate protection in these centres across the world. So this study was published earlier on this year with Christabel and Catherine as first authors, and this was looking at the core temperature after birth in babies with neonatal encephalopathy in a sub-Saharan African hospital setting. The point to take home from this is that it was only less than 20% of the time that babies had their temperature within the hypothermia range within the first 72 hours. And this is the mean temperature of the babies, and you can see that there's quite a big range. What was interesting was that babies with worse encephalopathy, and here you can see the temperature separated by a Thompson score of 0 to 6 in grey, 7 to 15 in black, and those who died in red. You can see that the babies with worse encephalopathy or Thompson score were much cooler, and you can see that some of them dipped down below 33 degrees and some very, very low. So it is important to be aware of facilitated passive cooling to logically design future clinical trials in low and mid-resource settings. So back to high-income settings, why are we looking for agents that we can add on to cooling? It's really because almost 50%, and we've just heard from a presentation from China, up to 60% of babies still have adverse outcome. Is this because we are too late to start cooling, the injury is too severe, or is it because of inflammation sensitization? We are not sure. What I've put together here is a table looking at therapies that we have assessed in the piglet hypoxic ischemic model in the last 14 years. And I know many other people have looked at different things, but I think it's important to understand which are going to be most pragmatic in low resource settings. So we've looked at melatonin. The protection seems pretty robust. You need an IV line, but you don't need cold storage. Mesenchymal stem cells, you may ask, why on earth are you talking about this in a low and mid-resource setting session? However, we've done a pilot study. I'm going to talk about it today. You don't need an IV line, and that may well be important if you're giving it intranasally. Magnesium, you need an IV line, no cold storage. Xenon and argon, no IV lines, but the problem with the ventilator cost, etc., and the cost of xenon itself is an issue. Dexmedetomidine in our hands has shown toxicity. EPO, this is under analysis, and remote ischemic post-conditioning is something that I think needs a good look at, because this is the only one that has complete green and 3 ticks. So, in the course that we ran yesterday, I talked at length of the evolution of secondary energy failure, with your brain energy levels after birth coming down, then at resuscitation recovering, and your lactate to N-acetyl aspartate as being a very robust marker of outcome and of your secondary energy failure. And what I'm going to talk about today briefly are 3 agents, 2 of them to be used in the acute phase, in the very early phase after birth, and that's melatonin and magnesium. And then I also want to touch on some work we've done with stem cells. Our primary outcome measures in the UCL piglet model try to be focused on the clinical scene, so we use AEG as our first primary outcome measure, because we know there's a strong relation between recovery after HI and outcome. And lactate to N-acetyl aspartate in white and grey matter voxels, we use this at 24 and 48 hours, and then we look at our tunnel positive cells in 8 regions and overall, and we know that this correlates very strongly with lactate to NAA. So, to start with melatonin, we've been working on melatonin for many years now, and it just does seem to be a very good molecule, but it's getting the dose and the timing right. So we know that melatonin is produced in the pineal gland, and darkness will stimulate this, light will suppress it. We also know that in your teenagers, they have very, very high peaks of melatonin, and when you reach your 50s, your melatonin is very low, and the highest peak that you have is at around 4 in the morning. I think it's good to briefly look at the rodent systematic review that was done on 400 animals, 28 studies, and looking at the effect size or improvement in outcome with melatonin given after cerebral hypoxia ischemia versus control, to show you that there is a strong biological effect in this model. Solid vertical line shows treatment and control are equal. Here you've got the point estimates and 95% confidence intervals for all the studies, ranked for the effect size of melatonin given after hypoxia ischemia. And you can see the global estimate of the overall neuroprotective effect with an improvement in outcome with a point estimate of almost 43%. And 2 doses are better than 1, and you need to have more than 5 milligrams per kilo. We first published some work on melatonin and whether it augmented cooling when you gave melatonin plus cooling versus cooling. And this was published some 6 years ago, using a high dose of 30 milligrams per kilo started 10 minutes after hypoxia ischemia. Of note, we used an ethanol excipient. And again, our primary outcome measures, and these are the results on one slide. Taking you through it, we saw a more rapid AEG recovery when we added melatonin to cooling. We saw better energy metabolism with lower lactate to NAA. And just to show you the dose, the blood levels of melatonin that we were seeing was 10 to the 5 baseline. But we also saw an increase of around 6 to 15-fold in those piglets who didn't receive melatonin. So this is an endogenous response. So we saw reduced tunnel-positive cells in grey and white matter, and some changes in gene expression signaling some immunomodulatory and microglial effects. So we thought this was great, and we went on. We worked with Chiesi on an ethanol-free, highly concentrated formulation without, which was safe for neonatal use. And we looked at different studies and different timing. And what this paper, which was published earlier last year, showed that if we used 15 milligrams, we saw some protection, but we lost protection, we think, because we gave a very slow, cautious infusion over 6 hours and only achieved therapeutic levels by 8 hours. We saw no protection in our model using 5 milligrams per kilo. This was a useful study, and from this we were able to do PK modeling, and we saw that if we gave 18 milligrams per kilo at 1 hour and gave that infusion more rapidly over 2 hours, we should achieve therapeutic levels. And this was the study that we did recently, where we take the piglets, we do baseline testing, hypoxia ischemia randomization to cooling for 1 to 13 hours. We use ethanol vehicle by itself with cooling, and then melatonin plus ethanol given at 1 hour and at 25 hours. Euthanasia at 48 hours, and that's where we look at the tunnel cells. And this is the data in one slide showing that we achieved therapeutic range of the melatonin within 2 hours. We saw a more rapid recovery of AEEG with the melatonin plus ethanol. So by 19 hours, we had a higher activity on our AEEG. We saw better brain energy metabolism with ethanol and melatonin combined, and we also saw reduced tunnel-positive cells in the hypothermia plus melatonin. However, the elephant in the room here is that ethanol is partially protective, and you can see that we are getting quite a protection here. Even your AEEG is recovering more rapidly with ethanol than without. So this is just music to our ears. I'm sure that ethanol is good for you and that possibly we should be taking more of it. And indeed, we know from stroke work in adult rats that neuroprotection is seen with low-dose acute ethanol administration within 4 hours of transient hypoxia ischemia. Mechanisms such as HIF-1 alpha expression, reduced cerebral metabolism, etc. However, I don't think we could be using this in our babies. We know that in babies they seem to have increased vulnerability of the developing brain to ethanol. We know that in adolescent but not adult rats, high ethanol doses upregulate toll-like receptor signaling. And we also know it may well be related to inhibition of cortical activity. So therefore, we need to have ethanol-free medicines for our babies, and so we need to be using melatonin that does not have ethanol in it. We have just finished a study called the Empathy Study, which is EPO plus melatonin for perinatal asphyxia with therapeutic hypothermia, looking at single therapy of cooling or cooling plus melatonin double therapy or cooling plus EPO versus triple therapy. We're just looking at the data now. It's quite exciting, quite unexpected, and we'll be able to share that with you, I hope, in a few months. Moving on to magnesium, Ingram Lingam has done a lot of work on magnesium, and we've just published this paper on short-term effects of early initiation of magnesium infusion combined with cooling after hypoxia ischemia in term piglets. I take you through this. Basically, baseline hypoxia ischemia and piglets were randomized to cooling plus a magnesium bolus and then a constant infusion versus cooling by itself, and this was given at 1 hour. What we were trying to achieve from many PK studies before was a magnesium serum concentration of around 1.5, which we did in most piglets. And we also saw that in the CSF we had a rise in the magnesium CSF levels, modest as it was. We saw a modest protection with magnesium sulfate. I include it because it is a simple drug that we have at our fingertips at the moment. We saw a more rapid recovery of AEEG, but only when we excluded the piglets who had mild encephalopathy. We saw an overall reduced tunnel, but not any reduced tunnel in specific regions, but we did see increased oligodendrocytes. So, number one, I think using serum magnesium sulfate, doubling the serum magnesium with hypothermia was safe. We think that the small incremental benefits of magnesium and hypothermia versus hypothermia may not translate into substantive long-term improvement, but I don't think we should leave it behind because it is something that may well be the icing on the cake, and we can add to our other agents that we're adding to cooling in combination of multiple therapies. And finally, stem cells. We know that 95% of the effect is due to parenchyme chemical release and only 5% due to engraftment and differentiation in the host tissue. And there are several randomized controlled trials ongoing at the moment for BPD, stroke, and neonatal encephalopathy. And we heard very nicely this morning the trials that will be going on in BPD. We used mesenchymal stromal cells. They are attractive, they have low immunogenicity, self-renewing capacity, and multi-lineage differentiation. And we obtained them from this company, which is under license from UCL, that makes innate immunotherapies at hospital grade. So we wanted to assess if 2 doses of 30 million human umbilical mesenchymal stromal cells at 24 and 48 hours augment hypothermic neuroprotection. We wanted to compare intravenous versus intranasal administration, and this is a pilot study. It's not fully powered, but it is I think, of interest. We looked at AEEG and, of course, MRS and tunnel. This is our design randomized to hypothermia and vehicle, hypothermia plus intravenous human umbilical stem cells, and hypothermia plus intranasal cells. This is us giving the umbilical-derived stem cells intranasally, and you can see our piglet is kept slightly head up to keep the cells in. And on the AEEG, you can see the color code is hypothermia, intravenous stem cells, and intranasal stem cells. And I think we're starting to see a biological effect whereby at 25 hours we're seeing a recovery in the AEG that's quicker than the others in those who had the intranasal stem cells. We saw better brain energy metabolism with the intranasal stem cells compared to hypothermia, no change on lactate to NAA. And nothing significant on our tunnel positive cells overall, but if you look at the white matter, you can see here that there's almost no dead cells at all in the white matter. So I think we need to be considering intranasal delivery as a real option in neonatology. We know from studies done by Cora that actually these stem cells can get into the brain within 2 hours and maximally are there at 12 hours. We're just doing these tracking studies at the moment, and they migrate through these different pathways. So no evidence of short-term harm using stem cells in combination with hypothermia, no benefit of intravenous stem cells, and intranasal stem cells may well be something we could be using. And actually, possibly, this could be something that might be useful in some low-resource settings where it is difficult to get an IV. Is inflammation important? I think what Kali Tan's work has shown in Kampala, Uganda, is that independent risk factors for neonatal encephalopathy are bacteremia and phagocytis with these very high risk factors. Catherine Martinello published this paper looking at a new model that we've developed in the piglet, inflammation-sensitized hypoxia ischemia, whereby we looked at sham, LPS by itself, hypoxia, and LPS plus hypoxia, with LPS started 4 hours before the hypoxia. The take-home message is that if you have LPS sensitization before hypoxia, you get a severe increase in your tunnel-positive cells in this orange bar here. And we have been trying to find messenger RNA expression of inflammatory markers that can differentiate hypoxia from LPS-sensitized hypoxia. And we think that IL-1 alpha, CCL2, and IL-8 are able to show some difference. And of interest, for those of you who were in the poster session just now, IL-10, even in the piglet here, is a marker of injury severity, even at 6 hours. Interestingly, when we start to cool in this model, we see no protection. So LPS-sensitized hypoxia ischemia randomized to normothermia or cooling, there is no protection. Which brings me on to the last part, and that is, should we be thinking of immunomodulation and other things instead of hypothermia in these low-resource settings? I think azithromycin is something that's very interesting. Azithromycin, as we buy over the counter and we give to ourselves and our children, modulates the M1 to M2 shift, and it's a potential way to protect the brain with a long therapeutic window spanning acute and subacute and chronic periods. You do need to remember it can prolong the QT interval, and we know that cooling does that, so safety studies are needed, and those are underway in the piglet. And I refer you to John Bark's lovely work looking at azithromycin in the rodent model, where hypoxia ischemia here, the second one is 1 dose of azithromycin, and here is 2 doses of azithromycin. And to finish, I think this is really important and is certainly changing how I'm running the studies in the lab. We know that actually there are 2 different pathways by which cells seem to die in the brain. One for the boys, where you've got more free radicals, and it's much less dependent on caspase activation pathways, whereas in the girls there's less free radicals and much more dependent on caspase 3 cleavage. And it may well be that we need to be thinking of different agents for different sexes. And that comes back to this important slide, which reminds us of the two big issues across neonatal encephalopathy: the inequality, the huge burden in this setting, and the increased burden in boys. So I'd like to leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention. And I'd also like to thank all my collaborators, all the people who work with me at UCL, Boris in Maastricht, the team from Paris, the team from Cork, Washington, Ghana, and Melbourne. Thank you very much.